Ever since I've been building the backend portion of my builds with Golang, it has become kind of an hassle to actually integrate the backend, the front end, and the database together, because when we were building applications with Next.js used to handle everything from the building to the deployment. But when you have a multi-environment deployments, it becomes very difficult um, for us to build our project with all these environments interacting with each other. So this is where a very neat little tool called Docker comes in handy, where it packages all of these environment into one unit and allows us to run and build it. So in this video, let us learn what Docker is, and I'll also provide you with the real world application on how to utilize it. So we'll be going through all the concepts such as the images, the containers, and how to use a docker compose file for us to interact with a multi-container environment. So this video will give you a very good foundation of how to use Docker. Let's move on to one of the core concepts of Docker, which is an image and a container. So an image is basically a snapshot of your software. So you give Docker a certain command which takes a snapshot of all the dependencies and configurations of your project, and then what you do is you run that image. So what happens is when you run that image, you get a container. So a container is basically a running instance of your image. So that is the basic gist of what a Docker image is, what a Docker container is. Because moving forward, you might get a bit confused between these two terms. So image is a snapshot and a container is a running instance of your image. Now I'll just give you a illustration of what we'll be building today. So we'll be having three different environments, which is the front end, the back end, and a database. So the front end is in Next.js, the back end is in Golang, and the database which we'll be using is Postgres. So what we'll be doing is we'll be taking an image or a snapshot of all of these different environments, and then we'll run all of these containers together in a multi-container using a new concept called docker-compose. So a docker-compose file is just a YAML file which specifies how different containers should interact with each other. So you generally use this file when you have a multi-container environment. So in our case, this docker compose file will mention which container should start before the other and how they should interact with each other, where it should save a certain instance of the container. All of that information goes in a docker compose file. Now this might be a lot to take in at the beginning, but don't worry, as we'll be building our rough template, which is the front end, back end, and the database, I think everything will be very clear to you. So let's move on to the coding part of the video. Before moving on, make sure you have Docker installed in your PC, whether you're using Mac, Windows, or Linux. Make sure you have Docker installed, because if you don't have this installed, it won't work. And also, this is a very good tool which is called Docker Desktop. This will allow us to see the various containers and images we have. We can start and stop it. So this is a very good tool to have in your PC. And the installation of this is very straightforward. I don't think you'll have any problem in it. So I'll just skip the installation process and I'll move to the coding part. So this is what we'll be working with today. So I've got a folder in a directory called Learn Docker. I got a folder called Frontend, which is basically a Next.js app. I created this with the npx create next app at latest, and you get this. It's just a bare bones project. If I go to apps page, you can see that I've cleaned out all that boilerplate. And then for the backend, this is again written in Golang. It doesn't really matter. You can have this in any other backend language. And here I have main.go, in which Gin is installed, and it just for this endpoint ping, it just prints out this your API service. So if we go to Mozilla, so this is how the front end looks, this is how the back end looks. So again, this is all from our local machine. So now what we'll do is we'll run this from Docker itself. So let's do that now. In our project here, let us navigate to the front end directory. In here, we'll have two new files. The first one being .docker-ignore. So this is pretty self-explanatory what this does. It basically ignores all the files mentioned here. The second one, and the most important one probably, is called Docker file. So Docker files are built-in layers, so we can use existing images to build on top of it. So in here, let me just paste in the code which will be required, and I'll briefly go over what this is. And you don't have to remember any of this. Everything is there in the documentation. So if you go to Firefox, you can find all of the various different configurations which they have. So you don't have to remember any of it. You just have to know where to find what configuration, right? So let me just go over what this means. So the first line basically tells Docker to use the base image, which is Node version 18. And then what we do is we use the command work dir, which creates a app folder in the container. So we'll be running our code through this folder itself. Then what we'll be doing is we'll be copying all the contents of packet.json to this folder, and then we run npm install. So then we get the node modules folder in our app directory. Then we copy this command, basically copy ... copies all the contents of the current directory. So in our case, this is the front end, to the app directory. Then we say expose 3000, so expose the port 3000, and we run the command npm run dev. So again, none of this, you don't have to remember any of this. Just go through over their documentation for whichever environment you're using, and you'll get the configuration for that. So that's basically what a Docker file, this Docker file does. So next up, we'll have to build this Docker file. So in order to build this image, the command which will be is docker build. You give it the tag name, so -t, and the name of this image, which will be front end yt. And then you'll have to mention where this Docker file is. So in our case, it's in the front end directory itself, which is right here. So I'll just give dot and I hit enter. I'll just increase the size of this. And when you're first building an image, it might take some time. So I'll just fast forward it to after its completion. So it's finished building the image for us called frontend YT. So now in order to see that image, we can utilize another tool called Docker Desktop if you've installed here. So you can see right here, we have this image frontend YT. So the next step would be to create a container out of this. And if you remember, to create a container, what you have to do is you just basically have to run the image. So to run the image, it's docker command, like the command docker run. You give it you mention the port. So we'll map the port 3000 of the local machine to the container, and you give it the image name. So in our case, the image name was front end YT, and you hit enter. So this will create a container for us. So now if I go back to my Docker desktop and go to containers, I should have a container where that instance is running. So in our case, see, the image is frontend YT and the container name is eager merc. You can change the container name as well. So we have a running instance of our container. So now if I go to port 3000, so now we are able to run our application through Docker instead of directly accessing it through our local machine. So this is how we create a Docker file. So now let's do the same thing for the backend portion. So let me go to VS Code here. You won't be able to stop it in this instance of terminal. So what we'll do is we'll create a new instance, and a good command to look at all the instance of the containers which are running is docker ps. So this gives you a list of all the containers which are running. So at the moment, the front end YT image is running, the container ID. So now to stop this, what we can say is docker stop, and you can either give the name or the ID. I'll just give the name, so which is Eagle Merkel. I'll give it here, I'll paste it right here, hit enter, and that should stop the Docker container. Okay, so now the Docker container is stopped. If I go back to the first instance, it's stopped, right? So now if I go back to Mozilla, try to refresh it, it goes, you cannot connect. So now let's do the same thing with the backend. So let's go to the backend instance. I'll clear this, so clear, and let's do the same thing here now. So for the backend, again, we'll have a Docker file here. So as we are using Golang, so one of the problems with Golang is that it doesn't have hot reload. So for that, what I found out was there's a specific, there was a blog written here. So if I go to live reloading in Go application, it has a slightly different configuration to how it was for the front end. So we install an external package called github, I don't know how to spell that, compile daemon. So this basically does the hot reload for us, and whatever changes we are being making to our project will be reflected in the container. So yeah, so it'll have a slightly different configuration, but if you're using some other environment, probably you'll have a other configuration. And just like I said before, you just have to look it up, you'll get the configuration. So again, I'll paste all the rules, as I like to say, in here in the Docker file. So again, the same thing, we use the base image, which is Golang, the version, and we specify some env variables. This is specific for our package which we'll be using for hot reload. Then we say the basic setup for our container, which is we copy all the contents of this directory to the app folder. We specify the app folder, and this command basically creates the app folder. So we create the folder, we copy the contents, and we mention the app folder as the working directory, and we run some basic commands for the hot reload. And this line is important because this line mentions where the build folder is at. So if you don't know, like when you have a Golang project, you run go build to create a executable file. So this line of code basically mentions that the go build output will be a API executable file, and we run that with .api. So it creates an executable file called API when you run go run build. So now since we've mentioned the Docker, the rules for our Docker file here, the next step is to create it. So again, we create it with docker build, we give the tag name and give the image name, which is backend yt, and we hit dot because our Docker file is in the current directory, which is the backend. So now if I hit enter, it should create that image for us. Okay, so it's created a build image for us. Now if I go back to Docker here and go to images, it should have a backend YT. Okay, so I've not got a backend YT. Let's see why that is. Let me go back to VS Code here, and it says failed to resolve, the Docker file cannot be empty. Okay, so basically I haven't saved it here. Let me save it, run the file again, and it will build the image for me. Okay, so let me go back to Docker here, and there should be a backend YT. So we have an image. Now what we can do is we can run our instance, our image. So docker run, we'll give the port, so port 8080, and again port 8080. So we map the local port to the container port, and we give it the image name, which is backend YT. Now if you go to Docker desktop and go to containers here, we can see the running instance backend YT, and the container is Stoic Shimmer. So now if I go to this port 8080, Okay, I'm getting an error. Let me go back to VS Code. Let's see why that is. So it just required some time for the build to get over. So once the build was done, the server started running in port 8080. So if I go back to Firefox and refresh this, we're getting 404 page not found because this is the wrong endpoint. It's 8080 ping, and we get your API service. So if I go back here, main.go, we have the ping endpoint and we have the message your API service. So that's the front end. I mean the back end. Now the next step would be to create the database. So for the database, if we go to Firefox again, we have, if you go to the official documentation of Docker for the Postgres section, you can see right here it's pretty straightforward to create a Postgres container. So what I'll do is I'll just copy this line of code and I'll paste it right here. So this basically says to create a database called to create a container called some Postgres. So we'll rename this to dbyt, and we specify some environment variables. So the password for the Postgres, which is my secret password, and we also give the image. This -d is basically for mentioning to run it for running the command in the background so that we can still use the terminal. And this Postgres is basically the image name. So now if I hit enter, this should create a container, a running container for us. All right, so now if I go to our Docker desktop, you can see we have a running instance of our database right here, the container. And if I go to image, it's Postgres right here. So that's basically how you would create the like a container for each of the Docker file for backend, frontend, and the database. But this is not ideal, as when you have more than one container, it becomes a hassle because you'll have to go to this directory backend, start the container, stop the container. So what we can do now is we can create a YAML file called docker-compose, and this file basically says how each of those containers should interact, in what order should they start. So all of these configuration will be put into this YAML file, and we can just hit one command to run all the servers. So that's what we'll be doing now. So the first thing is we give it the version of the YAML, which is 3.8. I think this is probably the latest one. Next is we define the services. So what services will be there in this project? So in our case, let's give it a backend service. This can be any name. So I give a backend, and I can say which container name. So what the name of the container would be. So I can say container name will be backend. Let's say backend YT. I think I've already have a container name with that. So let's say backend Docker. Yeah, that's fine. And we can say the next is build. We give it the context. So the context in our case is not dot, because this is in our root directory. The Docker file which we want to build is in a backend folder, Docker file. So in that case, it's ./backend, and we mention the file which is the Docker file. It's of type Docker file, and then we have to mention the port to which it has to map to. So in our case, it's port 8080 should be mapped to 8080, and then this is something new which is called volumes. So volumes is when you want to persist the data outside of the container. So in our case, as we are using something like hot reload, we'll have to give it this volumes property right here. So this basically mounts the backend directory to our app folder, and all the data will be persisted outside our container. So whenever we are making changes, and once we hit save, all that changes will be reflected in our container. So then we can say it depends on database. So this basically tells us to start the database before this service. So we'll have to create this service called DB. So anything which you let's name it database actually, which will be more verbose. So this basically says to start the service database before backend. Once this starts, backend starts. So then the other rule would be links. This is also similar to that, links to database, right? So now what I can do is, this is our service for the backend. So now I'll just copy out all of this and do the same thing for the front end. So now I'll hit enter. Front end container, let's name it as front end docker, and the build is in the front end directory. It'll be of type docker file. The port will be mapped to port 3000. Same thing right here, 3000. And volumes, we want to persist the data of our next app to our container. So this will be front end, and depends on, this will depend on the backend. So we can just say back end. We don't need this. So again, okay, this is not okay. Yeah, this will be front end. So the service name for this is front end, and this configuration basically tells us start the backend before the front end, and this backend will be dependent on database. Okay, I think the spelling is off here. Cool. Now again, I'll do the same thing right here. So if I come down here, database, container name, let's call it db. Oops, wrong command. db docker. Build context will be okay. So in here we'll have to create a new folder called database, and it will be of type docker file. Port will be 5432, and we'll say 5432. And next is, we'll have to define the environment variables, because our database will have the username and the password, so we'll have to mention it right here. So here I can say environment, and I can say postgres user as postgres. Okay, I'll just give it as my name instead, Darbish, and I can keep the password as postgres. You wouldn't actually name it as such, but since this is just for the demonstration purpose, I'll leave it at that environment. So now I'll also change the name, database. So this service is called database. So if you would mess this up, this wouldn't work, right? So the sequence of this would be, it first starts the database, then goes to the backend. This service will be launched, but as this is dependent on database, it will run this service first, then the backend will go, then the front end will start. So that's the sequence on how the service is defined, right? So the next step is, we don't have this file yet. So what we can do is, we can create a new folder called database, and inside the database we can create two new files. So one would be the docker file itself, and the other is create.sql, and I'll explain what this is shortly. Okay, so in here, in the docker file, we can use the base image for Postgres, so from Postgres. And in here, what we can do is, the command to actually create the database, add, and we'll say create.sql, go to that create.sql file right here, and say docker entry point init db. So whatever, now in this file, whatever commands you specify, so if I say create database vms, so whatever the commands which you type here will be put into this file during the time of execution, right? So this is, all of this is from, again, from the official documentation itself. There should not actually be this file. So whatever commands you put into this file will be put into this Docker entry point in a DB, and those commands will be executed. So you can create database, you can create tables, and all of it will be defined at the time of initiation. So now if I save everything, and now I can run all of these containers with just one command. Now let me try running this program. So I'll hit docker-compose up build. All right, so I get an error saying constrainer. Okay, so this is basically, I have misspelled this. It should be container. I save that, and now if I compose build, this file should probably build. All right, so the images are getting built, and you can see the logs being made here. Okay, cool. So now if I just increase the size here and go db docker, backend docker, running build command, front end, everything is started. So now if I go to Docker here, you can see we have a container called learn docker. If I click here, inside this container we've got 3 additional containers, which is the database, the backend, and the front end. So now all of our container is working, and we can check that by going to the browser. So if I go to localhost 3000, which is right here, if I refresh this, I should probably be getting this thing, front end. Wow. So initially when you first run this program, it might take some time because it'll be building right here. So if you check the logs right now, you can see our backend server is now ready, but our front end is still installing some configurations. So let's just go ahead and check with the backend. So if I go here and go to a new one, so let's say localhost 8080 and hit ping, we get the response here. If I go back here, you can see we've made a get request right here, ping. So our backend is up and running, but the front end is still compiling. So it might take some time initially, but once it starts, it'll be seamless. So till then we can go and check our database. So let's do that. So if I go to my terminal right here, okay, that's fine. So docker ps, all the running instances, we care about this db docker. So in here I'll say docker exec, I want to go to the terminal, so -it, and we give the name of the image or container, and then I say psql, I give the username. So in our case, if I go to VS Code back here, you can see the name I mentioned was Tabish. So I'll go back here and say Tabish, and we are inside the container right here. So now to list all the database, it's like this /l, or rather this /l. Yeah. So now we have a list of all the database here. So as you can see here, we have our database called VMS, and I'm the owner, Tabish. So our database is also created. So this means that our database is up and running. And if I go back to the our VS Code right here, you can see the front end, the compiling is also done, and our logs are also being made for our database. So if I go back to our browser and refresh it now, everything works. So now let me go back to VS Code just to show you that the if if I go to VS Code right here, I'll go to front end, I'll say go to app page and say build the UI here, and I hit save. You can see it's already compiled, and if I go back to our browser, build the UI here again. If I go to Visual Studio Code, the same for the backend. If I go to the backend, go to main.go and say your API service, so I'll say ping pong. I hit save, and you can see the backend is already building and it's already compiled it for us. And if I go to Firefox again, go to localhost 8080 ping, and if I refresh this, it's pong. So with this we have configured our Docker. So again, Docker Compose is like a single source of truth where we say how each of the containers should interact with each other, how it should start, and yeah, so that's basically what Docker Compose file is does. So in the future videos, we probably can build a full stack application using all what we have learned here today. So I hope this is useful, and thanks for watching.